Hi and welcome to today's live chapter reading of Sexy Drug by Melody Calder, courtesy of Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. The sun shone down on the roof, heating the black tar to almost unbearable. His black clothes covered him from head to toe, and he cursed the damn builder that decided this was the one and only roof in the Beverly Hills wealthy shopping area to use the shit. It was the only clear shot he had at the spa. The little bitch was going to come out any time now. He wiped his brow again, making sure the sweat didn't get in the way of his view through the scope of his TAC 50C rifle, bullets loaded and ready for the only child of his client's competition. His military training was what made him a lethal killer, and his ability to complete every job in a timely manner was what made him the most sought-out killer for hire. Most people thought of assassins as dark, broody men covered in tattoos. This he was not. His sandy blonde hair and blue eyes made him look like the average Joe next door. As a matter of fact, he lived in a quieter neighbourhood in the suburbs, manicured lawns and all. His house was simple and clean. Nothing that would give him away as anyone other than a typical resident of the neighbourhood. No one knew about the hidden room behind his closet that held his tools of the trade. The contractors just thought he was one of those paranoid people that wanted a panic room. This was a big job. The pay was higher than normal because, if he were caught, the father of his target would never allow him to escape with his life. "Where the fuck is this princess?" he muttered as the minutes ticked by. He'd been there for hours already. "Should have taken her out when she entered," he grumbled. Since he hadn't been completely ready then, since his client wanted it to be on the way out instead of in, and for what reason he didn't know or give a shit. 3 hours of being on the hot-ass roof gave him plenty of time to get his exit back ready. No DNA would be left behind, for he had stopped in the roof stairwell and threw his black sniper clothing over his shorts and t-shirt. Once he was done, he'd strip the black, toss it in his bag, and look like a sightseer that frequented the area. Why the two just spent hours walking around the shops and restaurants they'd never go in, he didn't know. His only concern being that they'd be a perfect camouflage for his escape. Hell, the store below him was the one where so many stopped to get pictures just to be standing in front of the name. His mouth was as dry as a desert and he could feel the dehydration starting. This record heat was nothing compared to his time in the Middle East, but he'd grown soft over the 10 years since being discharged with honour, when his term was up. Those £110 of gear were no longer needed. Just a large backpack that held his tools for each individual job. Carefully he opened the small canteen and poured the now warm liquid in his mouth, making sure none hit the ground. He wouldn't be leaving anything behind. Not that he had any records to match his DNA. He'd paid a hefty sum to have an insider wipe all records of his existence from the government computers, including his military record. He wouldn't take any chances, and he didn't give a shit about losing his status as a vet, having become a very well-paid assassin for the private sector. He didn't need to worry about saving a few bucks on entertainment, and he certainly didn't need the health services. As the sweat seeped into his clothes, he wondered if they'd make him stand out. Picking up his binoculars, he peered over the roof as he checked out the throngs of tourists below. Sweat-stained men and women assured him that he wouldn't need to worry about that part. At least one thing went right on this fucked-up job. A limousine pulled up and he peered through his scope. It was definitely one that would pick up his mark, and he waited, his finger itching to pull the trigger and be done with it. It was an agonising 5 minutes for 2 brunette women to exit the spa, both with large sunglasses and hair styled the same way. Son of a bitch, he swore to himself, as he realised he didn't know which one was his intended target. He had only seconds to make a choice or blow the assignment. The client had been insisted that it should happen on this day and at this spot. They'd paid the non-returnable down payment of half. He'd never missed a mark, and he wasn't going to start today. 2 would have to go down, starting with the one on the left. Pulling the trigger, the bullet hit its mark and the woman went down, followed by a loud, high-pitched scream that hurt his ears, even from the long distance that he was from them. Quickly he aimed for the second woman and made the shot before hurrying to get his gear packed. With precision, he took apart his rifle in 10 seconds and tossed it in the bag. As he made his way to the stairwell and descended, he stripped off his black clothing and tossed them into the bag as well. The cold air conditioning was refreshing, and he found his sweat drying by the time he reached the back door and exited into the alley. Making sure no one was around, his black cap was the last to come off, ensuring none of his hair would be in the vicinity of the roof. Not that he thought anyone would figure out where he shot from. Only rookies made mistakes in assuming, and he was no rookie. Tussling his sandy blonde locks, he went the opposite direction of where the sirens were now blaring, headed to the women that were surely dead. The crowds of tourists took no notice of the man who joined their midst. Their eyes were too focused on the shops that lined the streets of the wealthy shopper's paradise. Now changed from his personality of K, hired assassin, to the wealthy, to a normal everyday citizen, he hailed a cab to take him back to his car that he'd left in a parking garage over in the next town. He wouldn't dare be stupid enough to have any connection to being on the spot of the murders, and the cab fare was a small price to pay to complete the assurance of that. The cab pulled in front of the bookstore only a block from the parking garage, another way for him to make sure there was no connection. He'd buy a book and be on his way back to the suburbs where the money was being transferred to his account. Making the call before he entered the store, he simply said, "It's done," before hanging up. Chapter 2. "You looking for a death wish, Johnny? 'Cause I can give that to you," Carol Rosamond growled at his driver. "Who the fuck shot my daughter?" He looked around at the men gathered in the grand office of his mansion. They all looked scared shitless, the pathetic losers. All but one, the man who had a face like stone and a body to match, Ramon. He stood straight, his massive tattooed arms crossed over his chest. The only indication Ramon was feeling anything was a tick in his jaw, one that showed his annoyance, but towards whom was far beyond Carol's knowledge. Ramon had been with him for 2 years, starting as a runner, a mule, and working his way up. He showed that he had cojones, something needed to be part of the inner circle. He wasn't afraid to do whatever it took to get the job done. So far he'd been an asset in the business, and working his way up to be the most trusted in the short time he had been taken into the inner circle. Not that Carol trusted anyone fully. That was a mistake he would never make. Johnny's voice pulled his thoughts away from his newest fixer, the answer not causing the need to make some heads roll. Recede. "I don't know, boss. I didn't even hear a shot." Johnny spoke with a tremble in his voice. "As soon as Amelia went down, I tried to get Katie in the car, but she wouldn't listen. The next shot was so fast she didn't even have time." He knew damn well that the only daughter of one of the area's biggest kingpins was invaluable. Johnny wasn't going to make it out of alive, but he was sure going to try. Carl looked at him with his brow creased, his eyes taking in every detail of the driver that stood before him with his head down. The blonde-haired man was still partially dressed in his suit, the jacket gone and his tie undone and askew. The sleeves of his one crisp shirt rolled up, the entire thing covered in blood spatter. "You mean to tell me that my 100-pound daughter couldn't be pulled to safety by a man as big as you?" Carol demanded to know, the volume of his voice rising with each word. Johnny looked down at the floor as he gathered his words carefully. Whatever he said next would determine whether he lived or died at the hands of his boss, and he knew it. He'd been around long enough to see how the smallest infraction would put the man in a bloodthirsty rage. "Boss, it happened so fast. It was a good thing I didn't pull her away, because she bent down, and that's how the shooter missed a kill shot. I'm certain of that. You know I would give my life to protect Katie. She's like family to me." Carol barked out a laugh. Not one full of humour, but one full of malice. "You think I should be thankful that my daughter was only wounded?" No, 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 that's not what I'm saying at all," Johnny tried to backpedal, his message not coming across at all. Not that anything he could say would change the man's mind. He was feared because of his lack of compassion and habit of making people disappear, no matter how close they were to him. His only daughter was the only one safe from his rage. "I know we're all angry and hurt, but also thankful she's alive. Like I said, I'd give my life to protect her. You just might, Johnny, Carol muttered, before raising his voice to the others that stood behind him. Juan, Desi, Petey, get your asses out there and find the word on the streets. Someone has to know something. I want the head of whoever shot my Katie on a platter. The men scrambled to follow Carl's orders and get the hell out of there with their life still intact. And they certainly did not want to see what would happen next with one of their own. Not because bloodshed was a problem, not in their line of work, more that they didn't want the reminder of their own fate if they fucked up. He turned to the remaining men, Ramon, Johnny and Danny. Ramon, you call Walsh and make sure he takes care of Katie. I don't want her traumatised with police questioning. Report back once you're done. Ramon nodded and pulled out his cell phone as he left the office, closing the door behind him. Folding his hands in front of his face, his index fingers pointing up, Carol tapped them together. Now, Johnny, what am I going to do with you, huh? Boss, I fucked up, I know. I'll make it up, whatever you want me to do. I'll wash your fucking cat's ass with my tongue for the rest of my life if it would make it better. Johnny tried to plead with the cold-blooded killer in front of him. You know I'd never purposely put Katie in harm's way. I've been driving her around since the first day of kindergarten. She's like the daughter I never had. I love that girl. Then you should know that this is unforgivable, Carol said with a deadly calm, the kind of tone he used before something violent was about to happen. Placing his palms on the desk, he pushed himself up, the chair rolling back and hitting the credenza with a loud thump. Danny stood perfectly still, long since desensitised to the boss man's actions, as he waited for the instructions that were sure to come soon. He craved the brutality he would rain down on the driver. While he may have been short and stocky, his grey hair and wrinkled face showing with age, he was still fit and the one to be reckoned with. As the boss's right-hand man, he delivered the punishments and was feared almost as much as Carl Rosamond, leader of the drug cartel that brought the most cocaine into the United States. The two men had started in Mexico, Carol building the empire it was today, with Danny by his side. When the Mexican army was deployed to crack down on its operations, they fled over the border, leaving behind the disposable men and women to keep their business going. Danny himself was the one who performed most of the punishments for those who dared defy the boss. His bastard son Petey was much the same and helped with supervision, Juan Carlos to keep everyone in line in Mexico, until just recently. Petey was called to come home when Carol decided his own value was needed on this side as the man who would find insiders to pay off. Cops, feds, custom agents and border control in both countries, and even the Coast Guard. If it was a port of entry, Petey had people in his pockets. Aside from a decent fuck, Petey was the only good thing that came from his mother. Strolling over to the opposite side of the room, Carol paced as he viewed the large glass cases filled with his collection of football club memorabilia from his favourite team in his home city in Mexico. Carl's real name was Carlos, but he changed his name to better integrate into the United States, taking on an American last name as well. With his lighter colour skin and little work from the best plastic surgery in the world, he blended in well with the white Americans, and no one was none the wiser. He seemed to be lost in memories of the working vacation in Mexico almost a decade ago. He spent a good amount of time with what Americans called a soccer team, a term that had taken over him a long time to perfect for the sake of his cover. The framed pictures of Carol standing with the football club were the highlight of his collection, though the ball used in their first tournament, which they won, was a close second. He recalled the way the ball smashed into the face of their opponent at that game right before the game-winning goal was made. The crowd went wild at the win. Carl himself went wild, but for the bloodshed just as much as the win. If one looked close enough, they could see the remnants of the opposing team's blood, long turned brown. Most would think it was mud, but Carl knew the truth and it made him giddy.